Good afternoon, and welcome to the least controversial panel of Policy Orientation 2020. My name is John Hostetler, and I am Vice President for Federal Affairs of States Trust. States Trust is the federal outreach of the Texas Public Policy Foundation that was stood up in September of 2018. We will be talking about immigration policy generally, and specifically the tragic dysfunction that has resulted from America's broken immigration policy and the need for action. With us today are policy experts on the issue, and for those of you who were at a previous panel that I spoke on, we had 3 journalists and a recovering politician. But now that recovering politician will be leading this discussion with 2 experts on policy, and we look forward to their participation and their contribution. First of all, to my right is Ali Noorani. Ali is the Executive Director of the National Immigration Forum, a nonpartisan advocacy organization working with faith, law enforcement, and business leaders to promote the value of immigrants and immigration. Previously, he served as Executive Director of the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition. We thank you for being here, Ali. Next to Ali, to his right, is Mark Krikorian, who serves as Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies since 1995. The Center is an independent, nonpartisan research organization in Washington, D.C. It examines and critiques the impact of immigration on the United States, and he frequently testifies before Congress and has published articles in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and elsewhere. In a previous life, I served for 6 terms in the United States House of Representatives and was for 2 of those terms chairman of the Subcommittee on Immigration, Border Security, and Claims of the House Judiciary Committee, and Mark was in front of the subcommittee on many occasions. Before we get started with the discussion, the very important discussion, I thought it'd be good for us to get a little historic context. For example, let's see where we are. According to TPPF polling, and if you were here for the dinner that was led, this discussion that was led by Rob Henneke, you saw some of this information. In recent TPPF polling, done just a short time ago, the results of the poll inform us that this is a polling done in the state of Texas of Texan likely voters. The survey found that fully 80% would characterize immigration as a crisis, including 64% of Democrats and 75% of independents. I didn't include the Republican count there. The conservative consensus is pretty strong on this as well. But as you can see, this is along the ideological spectrum, along the partisan spectrum. This is understood to be a crisis. Well, that's where we are today. Let's take a look to get some historical context of where we were a short, almost 40 years ago. And do we have audio?
I'm very pleased that you could all be here today. I know how busy you've been with events leading up to Tuesday's election, and I want to congratulate all of you in the House of Representatives who've just been reelected. This bill, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 that I'll sign in a few minutes, is the most comprehensive reform of our immigration laws since 1952. It's the product of one of the longest and most difficult legislative undertakings in the last 3 Congresses. Further, it's an excellent example of a truly successful bipartisan effort. The administration and the allies of immigration reform on both sides of the Capitol and both sides of the aisle work together to accomplish these critically important reforms to control illegal immigration. In 1981, this administration asked the Congress to pass a comprehensive legislative package including employer sanctions, other measures to increase enforcement of the immigration laws, and legalization. The Act provides these 3 essential components. Distance has not discouraged illegal immigration to the United States from all around the globe. The problem of illegal immigration should not, therefore, be seen as a problem between the United States and its neighbors. Our objective is only to establish a reasonable, fair, orderly, and secure system of immigration into this country, and not to discriminate in any way against particular nations or people. I would like to recognize a few of the public servants whose unflagging efforts have made this legislation a reality. Senator Alan Simpson, Congressman Dan Lundgren, Chairman Peter Rodino, Congressman Ron Mazzoli have long pursued and now have attained this landmark legislation. Important roles were played by Senator Strom Thurmond, Senator Paul Simon, Congressman Ham Fish, Bill McCollum, Chuck Schumer, and many others in both houses of the Congress and in both parties. Additionally, I would like to note the excellent efforts of members of my administration who have worked so hard over the last 6 years to make this bill signing possible today. The long list of those in the executive branch is headed by Attorneys General Edwin Meese and William French Smith, who, with Immigration Commissioner Alan C. Nelson, have contributed greatly to our efforts to pass meaningful immigration reform. Future generations of Americans will be thankful for our efforts to humanely regain control of our borders and thereby preserve the value of one of the most sacred possessions of our people, American citizenship. So now, I'll get on with the signing and make this into law. Hope nothing happens to me between here and the table.
So this is where we were in 1986. You saw in the polling where we are today. This just reinforces the passage in Ecclesiastes that there is no new thing under the sun. I'm sorry to the panelists for having to endure that, but if I would have told you this, and I heard some of you snickering during the president's remarks, if I had told you the prominent role that then Representative Chuck Schumer played in immigration reform for President Ronald Reagan, you would not have believed me. So I wanted to make sure that in the last frame, if you will, you see President Reagan almost seemingly looking directly at then Representative Schumer. And so while there is no new thing under the sun, sometimes times change. But we're going to now move into a discussion, and I want to just reiterate and hold up there for a moment, just for posterity, if you will. Future generations of Americans will be thankful for our efforts to humanely regain control of our borders. And when he was speaking of our borders, he was mainly talking about your border, the Texas border, and thereby preserve the value of one of the most sacred possessions of our people, American citizenship. The Texas Public Policy Foundation and States Trust is working on the immigration front, and we are working initially in the area of border security, and I know some of you sat through that, and we're not going to spend nearly as much time, but I did want to give our panelists an opportunity to address this, as they are experts on the issue. And with regard to the statement of principles for our Border Security Coalition, and our executive director, Kevin Roberts, mentioned the tour that TPPF and some of our coalition partners took at the RGV sector down near McAllen earlier this week. We believe, the coalition believes, that securing the U.S. southern border and all ports of entry is the essential first step before other changes to U.S. immigration law can be made. Decisive U.S. executive and legislative action is required to update the asylum system and reduce the massive backlog of cases faced by our overwhelmed immigration courts. Immigrants must be admitted to the United States based on the overall best interests and needs of America's citizens and communities. And then finally, and we'll get into this discussion, the states, especially those like Texas, that are most impacted by federal failures on this front, are proper collaborators in achieving changes to the U.S. immigration system. Any solutions need to include an active role for the states that allows local priorities to be addressed. Now, in moving on to a policy discussion, I'd like to ask for input for our expert panelists on the idea of this evolution of a solution that may happen. And once again, there's a question mark there because not everybody necessarily believes that we are involved in an evolutionary solution at this time. But for background and for the purposes of discussing what asylum policy is, this is from statute. The Secretary of Homeland Security or the Attorney General may grant asylum to an alien if the Secretary of Homeland Security or the Attorney General determines that such alien is unable or unwilling to return to and is unable or willing to avail himself or herself of the protection of relevant country, and there's a discussion of what that relevant country is, because of persecution or a well-found fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. In 2018, the then Attorney General Session moved to impact the massive beginning of flows into the United States from the northern tribal countries of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador to frame the persecution issue away from the discussion of violence that is perpetrated on an individual, not by the state, not by government action, but as the result of violence directed by a gang, a cartel, or domestic violence. And I'd like to have the panelists talk about this, that the court in December of last year, no, excuse me, December of 2018, struck down this directive by the Attorney General to expand persecution out of the political sphere into the criminal violence sphere. And as a result, we saw in 2019 a large spike. Ali, what did you think about, first of all, the Attorney General Sessions ultimately acting Attorney General Matt Whitaker? What did you think of the move to limit the application of this particular provision of law, and then what the court did with that particular thing?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I really want to thank the Texas Public Policy Foundation for the opportunity to have this conversation. I think that the work that the foundation has done across a range of issues has really served the American interest, and I'm sure that this conversation and the process that TPPF is undergoing will do the same. So I really want to, first of all, start with a thank you to the organization. So last year I did 2 trips to Honduras. I spent a few days in San Pedro Sula and a few days in Tegucigalpa. And when I was in Tegucigalpa, when I was in Tegucigalpa in particular, had an opportunity to sit down with the country's Attorney General. Had an opportunity to sit down with the delegation of attorneys from the Organization of American States fighting corruption and impunity in the country of Honduras. Had an opportunity to sit down with faith-based non-governmental organizations that were fighting violence, corruption, poverty across the country. Sat down with farmers in the rural part of the country, sat down with youth in the city, with women in the city who were victims of violence. And this is what I learned. I learned that in a country like Honduras, which along with the rest of the Northern Triangle countries, it is a dangerous place to live. When you look at the data, they're consistently top 10, if not top 5, most dangerous places to live in the world. And that danger is a result of a state, national government, completely incapable of being able to keep their population safe. So you take that combination of violence against the individual, by individuals often, poverty, and corruption, people are forced to make a decision that any one of us would make. Any one of us would make that same decision. I want to escape violence. I want to make sure that my child does better than me. And that, I think, is becoming the reality in more and more places, unfortunately. The problem is that, as you point out, our asylum system is really dependent on violence and persecution by the state. So I think we have to we have to understand what's happening in these countries and what is the situation that these individuals are facing. And what can we do as a country to address these things? So soon after this trip, these numbers go up. What does the administration do? The administration decides to threaten and then withhold foreign aid. This foreign aid was helping some of these organizations battle violence, corruption, impunity, poverty. So my point here is that, what the Attorney General and the acting Attorney General did is that they, well within their authority, obviously, to say, okay, this is what we're going to return to a definition of state-sponsored violence. Okay, but the world is more complicated than that. That is why I think we need to have solutions that match that complexity. And that complexity is the combination of violence, gang violence, individual violence, poverty, corruption, and put in place the strategies that help these countries change their situation, but then create the legal pathways so that that family, that coffee farmer in rural Honduras, who's got skills that we can use, frankly, can apply for that agricultural work visa and get to the U.S. In a legal and safe way. The world is just not as simple as our antiquated immigration system treats it.
A couple of things here. First, what is asylum? What does this mean? What's the point of it? Our asylum rules are based on a post-World War II UN agreement, which we did not enter into. We then entered into a later version of it in the 1960s, and it was designed to deal with the fallout from World War II, from people fleeing all the various bad guys that were running around Central and Eastern Europe for so many decades. That was the point. It was a very limited, targeted phenomenon. What's happened is that it has turned into a way of dissolving the sovereignty of advanced countries here and in Europe. Obviously, we're talking about American asylum law here, but the same thing applies in Europe. In other words, the point of asylum for these transnational progressive organizations that are constantly pushing it is to pry open the borders of the United States and Europe so that the American people don't have the ability to control who comes into their country and decide how many people should come into their country. That's the first thing. The first thing you need to understand is that asylum is a surrender of sovereignty. Because it's a surrender of sovereignty, we need to keep the bar for who qualifies extremely high. The way the law is, this is the 1980 Refugee Act, the wording up there, and that comes directly from the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees and then the 1967 Protocol. Look at what it says. There's 5 reasons you could get asylum. You have to be persecuted, and this is in response directly to John's question. Persecuted means the state is doing it, not that there's violence around or that you live in Chicago and the cops can't stop the killing. It's persecuted by the state. That was the point. Stalin's coming after you. Hitler's coming after you. That's what persecution meant. Based on what? Based on race. Well, okay, that's pretty obvious. Based on religion. Again, obvious. Nationality? Okay. And then the 5th one is political opinion. You sort of get that too. You know, you're against the government, you're a different political party, whatever it is. What is that 4th one? Membership in a particular social group. That is one of these weasel word loopholes that is an engine of judicial activism. Because as Judge Alito, this is Justice Alito, but when he was still a judge, before he was in the Supreme Court, wrote in an opinion, any 2 people could be called a particular social group, and this is in fact what activists outside the government working in hand in glove with judges inside the government have done, is used this particular social group, in particular that category, as a way of sort of a little crowbar to kind of pry open the borders. And what Jeff Sessions did in the decision that John talked about was simply say, no, persecution means what the statute says. Now, Ollie is right in that the world has changed. But if we're going to change our statute, and I don't think that's a particularly good idea in the way that Ollie wants it, but if we're going to do it, statutes changed by what? Anybody remember? Yeah, there you go. So you watched the cartoon thing too about yeah, exactly, Schoolhouse Rock. Congress is going to have to change that if they want to change it. I actually have a very different opinion. I think, frankly, we need to withdraw from the UN treaty that we entered into under Nixon. This is another thing that President Nixon did to us, along with the EPA and all the rest of that crap. But the Senate approved it, but it was signed by the president and presented to the Senate for ratification, because the 1951, the original version of it, we did not enter into, precisely because it was a restriction on our sovereignty. We need to withdraw from the Refugee Convention and then set our own asylum law. And I think we should have an asylum law, but it should be based on what we, through our elected representatives, think is a good idea, rather than just cutting and pasting some UN agreement into our law.
Thank you. And as a previous producer of those weasel words, I agree wholeheartedly. But and we'll get into
you didn't
that
vote
shortly.
on this one, so.
I'd like to look at, once again, the evolution of a solution, and in that the Trump administration, without action by Congress or inaction by Congress, the president, the administration has entered into several policy changes. And included in those, and you once again, if you were with us in the previous panel, you heard about these generally, but I'd like for the panelists to address them specifically, and I know we could spend a lot of time on this, gentlemen, but if you could just talk briefly about migrant protection protocol, the various asylum cooperation agreements that we have with the three governments, and then the interim final rule, which is a little less understood, a little less known, and your perspective of where the Trump administration is going. And I will say this, one of the graphs that I wasn't able to produce, but as a result of our trip to the RGV, you could see very explicitly in just the Rio Grande Valley sector data that as a result of the December 18th decision by the court in the District of Columbia in D.C., the apprehensions along the southern border skyrocketed when it was determined that asylum would be granted, or a credible fear would be granted to individuals from the Northern Triangle countries. And it wasn't until these actions were put in place that began to drop precipitously. But if you could, Ollie, if you could just talk a little bit about, or Mark?
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me just quickly, so you understand what's going on. What's been happening, starting really in 2012, but it became public really in 2014. People were coming up from Central America, from the three northern countries of Central America. They were either surrendering themselves to the Border Patrol, or they were coming up to a port of entry and saying, I fear return to my home country, I want to apply for asylum. Asylum, they don't get asylum right away. What they do is they have to pass the first hurdle, which is called a credible fear interview. In other words, do you think Mickey Mouse is persecuting you, or is there something vaguely plausible about your claim? Well, we were getting overwhelmed, and so people were passing these credible fear, the first hurdle, which is deliberately low in statute. It's set to have a very low bar. And then they were let go into the United States because we had nowhere to put them. Well, guess what? People, they called home, and they said, hey, La Migra took me in. I said the magic words that the lawyer told me to say, and they let me go. Guess what? More and more and more happened. In May, it was out of control. And so what John was referring to is some steps the administration has taken to try to deal with that, because Congress There were things Congress could do. We won't get into too much detail. We can if you want, but Congress wasn't doing anything, as is their wont. And so what the president did is two kinds of things. One, it's called the Migrant Protection Protocols, or Remain in Mexico, which, as the colloquial name suggests, you can apply for asylum because the law requires us to take your application. But we don't let you go anymore, and you get on the bus and go move to, Maryland or LA or wherever it is where your relatives are. You have to go back across the border and wait for your number to come up, which makes the whole point of coming to apply for asylum irrelevant because nobody wants to stay in Juarez. The whole point of the gambit of asylum is to get into the United States. So that's the whole, that has been applied, I think, across the whole border now. The second thing is the asylum cooperative agreements. That's ACA, yeah. Asylum cooperation agreements. And what that is a safe third country agreement, essentially, which is to say, if you're passing through one of these countries that we now have an agreement with, we'll send you back and you have to apply for asylum there. Which really, if you think about it, no one should be allowed to apply for asylum at the Mexican border, at least no one who's not Mexican, because they pass through Mexico, in addition to probably Guatemala and Nicaragua and Costa Rica and Panama before that, and Colombia, and they all mostly start in Ecuador because there's no visas for anybody in Ecuador, so everybody goes to Ecuador and then they take a bus up to South Texas. None of these people should even be allowed to apply for asylum. Unfortunately, our law does require it unless we have one of these kinds of agreements that allows us to send people back, and they have to apply in Guatemala, for instance, before they're allowed to apply here.
So I would, let's see. So
you can disagree with everything. So.
You'll get used to this. So a few things here. You talked about this a little bit in the earlier panel about the role of the cartels in the smuggling of people and the trafficking of people from Central America. I really have come to believe that we have outsourced our nation's immigration system and our asylum system to the cartels. So again, when I was in Honduras, I'd be talking to folks who said, okay, I tried to make it to the U.S. I said, well, why did you do that? Who told you that it was possible? They said, oh, the guy in the corner connected me to the guy on the other corner connected me to the guy. And it was very clear to me quite quickly that there was a network of organized crime that was telling people, this is how you do it. Now, let me be clear. I am not sitting here saying that every person who makes it to the U.S. to ask for asylum should be able to get asylum. I want to be very, very clear about that. But I think we all can say that there are a number of people from, whether it's Central America or around the world, that are eligible for asylum. My point here is that the cartels, they were able to take the chaos and the brokenness of our asylum process and make the case to an individual family in Honduras and say, give me $3,000. I will get you to the border, and I will turn you can turn yourself over to CBP. So as I'm talking to these folks, they're saying, okay, I gave $3,000. I got on a bus. I was fleeing X, Y, and Z or poverty. And what happens to that individual on the way? They are extorted for additional money along the way in a place like Guatemala, which in my opinion, therefore, makes Guatemala much less than a safe third country. They are victims of violence along the way. Then when they get to a place like Matamoros along the U.S.-Mexico border, what happens to them? They kidnapped. And their relatives in the States, who may be a U.S. citizen, is then extorted for $3,000, $5,000 a person. So my point here is that the only thing that is happening as a result of our immigration system and the way that we treat and think of our neighbors to the south is that the cartels are getting richer, which I don't think is a very good policy strategy for us as a country. So what do we do about that? I think that the administration has an opportunity to say to Central America, okay, just like I said earlier, what are the strategies to get back up on your feet, restore the rule of law, and then create the legal pathway so that people who want to pursue economic-based immigration to the U.S. can do that. And then the folks who do get to the border, whether it's by foot or by air, they are able to apply for asylum. And along the way, what we're doing is actually resourcing the immigration courts so that we don't have a backlog of 90, 100,000 cases at this point, and therefore 30,000 people are camping Mexican banks of the Rio Grande Valley, again, being extorted or victims of violence by the cartels. Right now, the immigration system is certainly not serving our interests, and it's putting people in the middle who are looking for a different way. So let's create the legal pathways that they can achieve that.
A couple of things here. What Ollie is saying is that everybody from Central America who wants to come here should just be able to come here.
I didn't say that, Mark.
Yes, you did, because if they want to come here for economic reasons, we create the legal pathways, and if they come here seeking asylum, we entertain their asylum claim. So in other words, who's left? That's number one. But number two, the reason the cartels are able to exploit people, because Ollie was right in his description of that, is precisely because they can credibly tell people, if you get here and say the magic words, here's what you read, our lawyers in the U.S. gave us this card, read it, and they'll let you go. So, or send your kid, send your teenager on his own, who's not on his own, we'll take him up there, he'll go over the border on his own, and then, because there's a special status for minors, he'll be released into the United States. That's why cartels are able to tell people this. They're not lying to them. I mean, they're scumbags, but they're telling the truth here, and people know it because others who have gone before them call them up, and they say, hey, I'm with Uncle Julio in Chicago, and it worked. And so they're going to say, okay, well, let me do that too. So, yes, you could make this a safer process that the cartels are not able to exploit and profit from if everybody can just come legally and, there's just no limits. But if you're going to have immigration limits and immigration controls, you need to make them stick, because if you don't, you're going to end up with cartels being able to pitch sneaking into or using asylum as a gambit to get into the United States, and people will take them up on it.
Well, Ollie and I were having a discussion prior to this, and a point that I want to make clear is that even with a policy change, if with regard to asylum, unless individuals would desire to claim refugee status in a foreign country, because claiming asylum status, claiming refugee status are somewhat different, in that asylum status is claimed on the U.S. soil, but a refugee, for example, from Honduras, if an individual wanted to come, was a credible fear of persecution from gang violence as a result of the opinion, and they wanted to do it from Honduras and get direct transportation to the United States, they would have to claim refugee status. And refugees are capped every year, and actually this year they're capped to, I think, the lowest level since 1980 at 18,000. So
they also have to be outside the country of their nationality. So in other words, a Honduran would have to be in Guatemala or Mexico, yes, and then say, hey, I'm a refugee.
Right, and so they would still have to, so they're subject to the caps. So when the caps would be reached, they would still have to make the travel through Mexico, and they would be subject to cartel control as a result of geography, not necessarily as a result of policy. So I'm going to move on here, and we can probably guarantee that with a change in administration, there will be a change in this policy, as is the case in every election cycle if there is a new president. But my last point here, and we've talked about it briefly, do you gentlemen believe that Congress will play a part in asylum reform in the short term, meaning before January 2021?
Well, I know Senator Graham, who's the chair of the Judiciary Committee, has filed and is advanced legislation to address the asylum system. And from our perspective, there's some good pieces of this legislation: an increase in immigration judges. We do think that the immigration court system just doesn't have the capacity to adjudicate cases. It would be good if immigration judges could actually use their expertise and be able to review cases with the time and the resources they necessary, and also their, actually, again, be able to use their expertise. I do think that legislation would require that asylum cases are adjudicated in 100 days. That does seem like a pretty high bar. I don't think that cases should be taking, years, but 100 days to put together an asylum case would be setting people up for failure. And I've met, again, just a point to my examples, I've met, folks from Africa, from Cameroon, who are stuck in Juarez right now, who are the victims of persecution based on their religion, based on their political affiliation, and they are stuck in Mexico right now because of an overburdened court system. And that, if there's anybody who we would argue pretty clearly qualifies for asylum, it is that individual. And right now, the lack of resources that's being put into the court system is that person's in kind of living on the edge right now.
To answer your question, no. Congress is not going to be doing anything about this in the next year. Number two, this Cameroonian guy should be applying for asylum in Mexico. Mexico is a signatory to the UN Refugee Convention and the protocol. It's founded in 1951. It has an asylum system. It has an agency that deals with asylum called COMAR. It has a video that they took down now because too many people were watching it and actually using it, a video on how to apply for asylum. It was right there on their website, and it was, helpful, and there's all these smiling people, and this is how you apply. And he goes, and they got so many Central Americans applying for asylum now. They said, "Oh my God, we got to pull this down." One point on the judges: we do need more immigration judges, but think of immigration judges kind of like lanes in a highway. If your highway is choked up with traffic, people say, "Well, we got to add another lane." What happens 6 months after you add another lane? It's choked up with traffic again. There are literally not enough people in the United States to be immigration judges to deal with the volume of asylum claims that we could get based on our ridiculous asylum laws. So you can't just say the pipe has to be bigger. You have to feed less into the pipe, as it were, to begin with. You can't immigration judge your way out of this asylum crisis. You have to constrict the ability to apply for asylum in the first place.
Thank you. And we're going to kind of move away from asylum and the border into immigration discussion and essentially take a very fundamental question that we mentioned in the Border Security Coalition Statement of Principles, and that is, who should benefit from immigration policy to the United States? Seems like a pretty straightforward question, and TPPF has taken the position that, as a result of our research, that immigration should benefit the American people, and that states should play a significant role. Once again, returning back to the polling earlier of Texans, of likely voting Texans, 53% of Texans, quote, said they trusted the state of Texas to do the right thing on immigration over the federal government. The governor recently has said that as a result of the Trump administration's rule regarding refugee resettlement, that Texas will not be receiving refugees over the past 10 years, since 2010. The governor pointed out that Texas has resettled more than 10% of the refugees into the United States, more than their share demographically, geographically, however you look at it. And our TPPF research that's on the web, short commercial for that we've done regarding immigration policy since 1920 in the United States, and the Canadian and Australian systems that have their states and territories and provinces and territories respectively take a significant role in immigration policy. One thing that I learned, former chairman of the Subcommittee on Immigration, Border Security and Claims, learned is that in Canada, Quebec, the province of Quebec, decides who immigrates to Quebec. Canada does not decide, with the exception of a health screening and a criminal background check. Canada plays no part in deciding who immigrates to Quebec. Now, we're not advocating that at this point. We're just saying that federalism is out there, and it's being exercised by folks to our north. And we've learned recently that the UK The Home Secretary there is thinking seriously about immigration reform, similar that would mirror that of Australia. So I wanted to take a moment for the two of you to talk about, and this may be something completely new to you. I know that a lot of folks are kind of shaking their heads at the idea that states can take part in immigration policy. But what would be your perspective on beginning to talk about states being more active in immigration?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would state very clearly, hopefully, that we believe that immigration to the U.S. should be in the interests of the American worker and their family, full stop. So any sort of future immigration policies in terms of work or family or otherwise should be serving the economic and the social interests of the American worker and their family. Now, all the way to the north of Texas in the state of Utah, in fact, in 2011, they passed legislation that created a state-based work visa program. And they actually passed legislation that set up a partnership with a particular state in Mexico. And you know, from our perspective, frankly, we were one of the few organizations in the pro-immigrant space that said, you know what, this is a smart solution. We should be having this conversation of how states can be thinking about the immigration solutions that serve their economic and social interests. The Obama administration at that point did not grant the waiver that would have been necessary for the state of Utah to move forward. So I do think that there are a lot of very interesting ideas that have bubbled up from the states in terms of being able to, again, address the state's economic and social needs when it comes to immigration. I do think that, you know, the parallels to, you know, Canada and Australia get a little more complicated when you look at the size and the diversity of our economy at large, but also, you know, the current decision making process around immigration, which unfortunately runs through Congress. You know, no offense. But I mean, that's why
agree.
but that's why I think that the more the states are experimenting, and the more the states are saying, you know what, these are the constructive ways to move forward. It's a debate that is, I think, really helpful for the country.
Yeah, I generally disagree. I mean, this is a federal immigration policy is a federal matter because it's determining future Americans, future members of the American people, and that's not something that the Utah legislature should be deciding for Vermont and Florida. A couple of points here. One is the thing that Utah was pushing, and this has come up in other places, is an indentured labor program, importing workers into the state, not an immigration program, which is what Canada uses, where, you know, Quebec wants people who speak French, and so they get a lot of Algerians, which hasn't worked out great for them. But the point is, it's a different, I mean, we're talking about two completely different things here, number one. Number two, the talk about state-based immigration, or even sometimes you hear it at the local level, cities saying, you know, we want to have, you know, we want immigrants to be able to move to our city. That's because Americans don't want to live there anymore. I heard this years ago from the governor of Utah, no, not Utah, Iowa. He said, you know, our population hasn't been growing very fast and our young people are all leaving, so we want to import immigrants. Well, what's that going to solve? Why are young people leaving? You think the kids of the immigrants aren't going to leave too? I mean, if the school system isn't that good, or there's not a lot of opportunities, or whatever it is, I'm not even complaining about Iowa, I'm just saying whatever. A city, you know, you hear this a lot from big city mayors. Immigrants are reviving our neighborhoods. Well, why are they such dumps in the first place? Maybe it's your tax policy, your education policy, and other things, so that Americans don't want to have to leave either. And then if we have immigration, some immigrants will move there too. There's nothing wrong with that. But the point is, if you're using immigrants as a way of masking the consequences of your cockamamie left-wing policies in other areas, education, crime, whatever it is, that's not solving anything. That's basically using immigration as a kind of Band-Aid or a crutch. So no, I'm very skeptical about the idea of state role. I mean, you know, as a subsidiary to the federal government, in other words, you know, participating in a federal program maybe to some degree, I'm open to it, but as far as actually driving policy, no. And let me give you one final point on this. In the refugee issue, There is a federal, there's a state, or was a state role, because refugees are resettled in states and localities. When Congress passed the Refugee Act in 1980, they promised that they were going to reimburse states for all the costs that were being imposed on them by the resettlement of refugees. You think that's still happening? No. They started cutting it back. Well, okay, it won't be 100%, it'll be 80%. And then it'll be 60%, and then it'll be 40%. Now it's 0%. So, it's an unfunded mandate now for states to the extent, one of the areas where states actually do have a role in immigration.
I would just, I was in Iowa last week, so I feel like I need to defend Iowa for some reason.
I like Iowa.
Captain
Iowa, Kirk was born there.
Iowa's not a lunatic liberal state with cockamamie tax programs or something like that. But I spent some time working on a new project in small town rural Iowa, and got to see how some towns were shrinking because their population just wasn't replenishing itself, and therefore businesses weren't going there. And then you see other towns that were growing because their town leadership, conservative town leadership, said, you know what, we've got to figure out how we bring assets to our town, and assets for them are people. So now that town has got the best problem possible for rural America. You know what that is? How to manage growth. The other town has the worst possible problem for rural America. How to manage a decrease in tax base and population. So, again, this stuff is complicated. We all know this. We all know it's complicated. And when we try to boil it down to a simple talking point of immigrants are good or bad, it disrespects all of our intelligence. I think that we as a country, whether it's at the federal level, the state level, or the community level, we can do big things and we can take on complicated problems. And that, for us, means that we've got to figure out what's happening right in one rural town in Iowa that's growing because of immigration and all these other factors that are surrounding it, and what's not happening right in another town. And both of those towns are politically very, very similar. So, to say, it's, cockamamie left-wing stuff is, it's a trope that we all love to hear, and we all kind of giggle at, and we say, oh, you know what? Yeah, that's right. But it's oversimplifying, and I think it's insulting to our intelligence and our understanding of how complex this challenge is and how we need to rise to this challenge.
What Ollie's saying is that living in that town in Iowa is a job Americans won't do. And so foreigners need to be imported to do it. There's a reason people are leaving. Figure out what that is and fix it first.
We've got a few minutes left in the panel, and I wanted them to address, I wanted to try to possibly redeem Congress to some limited extent, not that it deserves it, and as a person who's not a part of the problem anymore, I did want to look into the recent passage of the House Ag Worker Bill and have you speak briefly on how this came about. There was bipartisan support of it. Republican support was not overwhelming, but there was bipartisan support for it, and it showed, does this show a possible way forward? Is this the way things can happen in Congress?
No. It was bipartisan in the sense of the old joke with the stupid party and the evil party, and they get together and do something bipartisan, which is stupid and evil. The farm worker bill that was passed was, one, an amnesty for current farm workers, which, honestly, I'm not a fanatic amnesty opponent. We have tax amnesties, parking ticket amnesties. If we have something we've screwed up in the past and we've fixed it, okay, I'm happy to clean up the mistakes of the past. I'm kind of a squish in that respect. But this doesn't fix the problems, because what it does is it amnesties illegal immigrant farm workers, but it does it via an indentured labor program and creates a kind of indentured servitude going forward for people who aren't here yet. This is a giveaway to ag interests that don't want to modernize their operations and automate. I mean, that's what it boils down to. Agriculture is not the grain and cotton and those kind of, field crops that are harvested by machine now, but fresh fruits and vegetables especially, and you see this in dairy as well. the automation and mechanization of those operations has been dramatically retarded by the availability, the mass availability of cheap foreign labor. You don't see that in Europe, for instance, where you still need people to harvest things, but the machines to harvest broccoli and Brussels sprouts and whatever you can think of, they're all developed in Europe or Japan because they don't have the same level of access to cheap labor. This simply perpetuates it. My article in National Review on this bill was Farming Like It's 1699. And that's what the bill's about.
So one of my favorite parts about when I'm on a panel with Mark is that I often feel like I don't even need to say anything because half of his answers are, this is what Ali is saying. So let's talk about ag here. So I thought it was really important for the House Democrats to sit down with Republicans and say, you know what, let's find a compromise here. Democrats didn't have to do that, right? They could have rolled the Republicans and said, this is our solution, you deal with it. But Zoe Lofgren and others, they took a step back, they took a beat, they sat down with Mike Simpson and other Republicans and said, okay, what do you need? This is what we need. And they put the interests around the table as well. You even had a person like Devin Nunes, who was incredibly close to the administration, sign on to the legislation in the end.
In a farm district.
This is the interesting part about the mechanization of agriculture. Now, I would agree that there are certain parts of agriculture that can be mechanized. But fundamentally, do we want, in this particular case, in this particular sector, do we want robots doing this work, or do we want Americans doing this work? Or do we want nobody doing this work? And the situation that we're starting the trajectory we're starting to head down in agriculture is that it won't be done in the U.S. It will be done in Mexico. It will be done in China. So more and more, we will be importing our food, which, look at the oil industry. What is saving our economy to a large degree right now? What is saving it? The fact that we are fracking because we are producing our own oil. Now imagine if we get into a situation where we have an inordinate amount of percentage of our food being imported from around the world. That makes us less secure. So again, this is complicated stuff. We can figure it out. But let's not, say, in one case, not presume that somebody is saying, oh, Americans won't do this job, and then in the next breath saying, well, robots can, right? So let's have a complicated conversation about a complicated problem, and let's get to some solutions.
We're talking about radishes, not oil. This isn't even agriculture. This is corn is mechanically harvested. Wheat is mechanically harvested. Cotton, no human hand ever touches the stuff until it gets to Bangladesh or wherever it is that they sew clothes out of it. We're talking about radishes, tomatoes, strawberries. Those things all can be automated. Breitbart did this great thing where they matched these tweets from the United Farm Workers showing farm workers by hand harvesting particular fruits and vegetables. And, really real dexterity and real hard work. This is no knock on the people doing the work. Then they showed a video right next door of a machine doing the work orders of magnitude more productively. You had a woman who's an illegal immigrant farm worker kneeling in the dirt picking radishes, working her butt off. She was amazing that she could do with that, with that kind of dexterity. Then there was a machine that in 5 minutes harvested more radishes than she could harvest in an entire day. This is not a point about immigrant farm workers being bad. They're normal people, they're working stiffs like anybody else. The question is, what is in the interest of the United States? Medieval work forms of agriculture or modern agriculture? That's the only question. And the mass access to foreign labor for agriculture prevents the modernization of that entire sector.
Well, before we go to Q&A, I would like for all of us to thank Ali Noorani and Mark Krikorian for their participation. You are hearing different perspectives, but no more expert is there in all of Washington, D.C. on this very important policy. Now we'll be taking questions. And if there's someone, oh, Igor has a microphone. And if you could frame your question in the form of a question, I love to say that. I don't ever get to say that very often, but that would be most helpful. And this young lady right here would, if you could start the questioning.
My name is Adriana Aldin, and I came here legally many years ago. My question is for Mr. Krikorian. Mr. Krikorian, you are very nice and you are very good how you explain things, but I want to know what you have to say about your founder, Mr. John Tanton. Many people don't know that your founder of your organization comes from perspective of pro-abortion, eugenics, environmentalists, and you have been actually accused by Bob Price, who writes now for Breitbart, and other conservatives, and you know that. So I just want to know, how do you answer, because there are many people here that they don't know that most of the people in your board are very far leftists, but however your organization is not like that. So I just want to know if you can explain that.
Thank you for the message from the Southern Poverty Law Center.
No. I am a conservative. I'm not representing anybody.
You asked your question.
Yes.
I answer.
Yeah.
John Tanton
but you're
is
mentioning an organization that I don't agree with.
John Tanton is an eye doctor who's dead now.
He was your boss.
No, he was not.
Okay.
He never founded my center. He was a liberal. He was a zero population growth kind of guy. He was one of the people who started a lot of the immigration reform groups. He never had anything to do with the center. He raised a grant for us once. I neither embrace him nor renounce him because he has nothing to do with us. My chairman of my board is Ronald Reagan's U.S. Attorney for San Diego. Another member of my board was in the Bush administration as the head of asylum in the INS, and he was the sacrificial Democratic candidate a Republican candidate for Senate in Delaware. We have this issue doesn't split right and left. We have liberals on our board. We have conservatives on our board. There's not as many liberals as there used to be, actually. And in fact, one of my writers just had a piece in the New York Times saying, I'm a liberal and why I'm against, not against immigration, but why I want less immigration. And I write for National Review. So this is not an easily defined right-left issue. I neither embrace him nor denounce him.
We'll have another question. And this gentleman right here, please. Second, please.
Is there, I guess I don't understand why everything's focused on farm workers as far as giving them special preference to come. Is there any hope, any talk about a guest worker program that allows people to be here and work? Because my experience is the vast majority of people want to come here is not because they're being persecuted, it's because it's for economic reasons. They want to feed their families.
So you mean non-farm people is what you mean?
For non-farm.
Yeah, so the last time the Congress took up immigration reforms in that way in any meaningful fashion was in 2013 and 14 when the Senate put together legislation that passed and then it got stuck on the House side. Our take on this is that we absolutely need to establish a legal immigration system that creates the controls for work-based immigration. In fact, the Reagan clip to me is very interesting because, in that clip he talks about legalization of the undocumented and he talks about enforcement measures. What doesn't he talk about? He doesn't talk about the future needs of immigration, which since in 1986 they failed to address that part of the problem is a reason why we've got this disaster now. So that's why we think that if we're truly going to fix our immigration system, whether it's a merit-based, point-based system, whether it's some sort of a rebalance between family and work, we've got to be able to address that challenge for us because you don't have to look very far down the pike when you see a fertility rate decreasing, when you see worker shortages, not just in high tech, but in healthcare and construction, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say too often our immigration debate focuses on kind of the moment, right? The crisis that we all read about. It doesn't think about what the challenge is around the corner. We all know what that challenge is. So again, let's figure out what that solution. The way we thought that 2013 legislation was a really positive step forward because for the first time, Congress was able to develop a legal immigration strategy that had controls that fluctuated with the economy. So in construction, for example, if the unemployment rate within construction went up, immigration visas for construction went down, or vice versa. That's the kind of system that we need to be developing that can be nimble and flexible enough to meet the needs of employers, meet the needs of local economies. You know, I don't think we're going to get to that place before the election. Whether it's a second term or a new administration, we'll see what the environment looks like.
Ollie was talking about the Gang of Eight bill. That's the legislation that he was talking about. There are, in fact, guest worker programs. There's the counterpart to the farm worker program, the existing one. That's called H-2A, and then H-2B is the one that's seasonal but non-ag for low skill. It's been oversubscribed. People are constantly want more and more of them. But step back a minute. The United States has 1/3 of a billion people, stretching across an entire continent. We invented the modern world. We don't need to be importing people. Why would we need, I mean, why do we need any immigration at all? And I'm not even for zero immigration. But there's no actual need, certainly no economic need for immigration. Look now, the president actually even misunderstands this. He's spent the whole past year talking about how we need more immigration because the unemployment rate is low. The unemployment rate only counts people who have looked for a job in the past 4 weeks. What we have now, the percentage of adult people, working age people who are either working or actively looking for work is at one of the lowest levels it's ever been since the entrance of women into the workforce. It's nowhere close to what it was before the recession, the recent one, 10 years ago. And that was the peak then of the percentage of working people working was lower than the previous peak. Like 7 or 8 years before that. So we have a problem. There's no question. Ollie is right. We have a problem in developing our workforce. How is that problem solved? By importing more people from abroad. If what we're seeing now with a tight labor market, where employers have to hustle to find workers instead of workers having to hustle to find jobs, because it's always one or the other. The question is, which way should policy be? If policy is such that employers have to hustle to find workers, that means they're going to start looking at people they would rather not look at. Ex-cons now get a chance because there's just no other warm bodies around. Recovering addicts, homeless vets, disabled workers, single moms who have to negotiate a flexible schedule whether the employer likes it or not. If you're a single mom, I got to be home by 3 o'clock because of my kid. If there's 4 people out in the office waiting, the employer's like, well, thank you very much, I can't help you. If there's nobody out in that office, the employer's like, Jesus, I got okay, you know, well, I mean, I'll do what I have to do because I need a warm body. The best social policy is a tight labor market, and the economy exists to serve the people. People don't exist to serve the economy.
Right here.
So you didn't get much into the refugee question, and my question is because we've seen what's been happening in Europe with the refugee situation, and many of those countries are now even reversing that with women being raped, their countries being pillaged. And so how much of this do you think is a UN agenda-driven issue that's just being taken advantage of? And I say that as well as because I just saw a panel discussion about this issue on the refugee crisis and saying that, you know, that they're necessary and that they spend a year or two, usually spend a year or two in other countries before they're allowed to come here, and that's when they're being vetted, but with emphasis on usually. And as we see in those other countries, that's not necessarily the case. And then we have this migrant issue where throngs of people are trying to come at one time and just cross the border, you know, maliciously even attacking our border guards. So how do you address that concern, with especially considering that our birth rate plays into this as well?
So, first of all, I think what happened in Europe is that they try to address a problem without a solution. There were, the refugee and the asylum systems in Europe were just not ready to take on that sort of movement of people. So they were very much building a plane while they were flying it. And I think that explains to a large degree why, the public in Europe wasn't ready for those kinds of changes, much less the systems were not ready. I think fortunately for the U.S., we have a history that we're proud of when it comes to refugee resettlement, and particularly, with regards to the faith community, with regards to whether Catholic or the Jewish community, the Mormon community, the evangelical community. There are churches and synagogues around the country who are actively saying to refugees, we're going to help you resettle. We're going to help you establish your home here in the U.S., whether it's rural, suburban, or urban. The fact is that people are going through months, if not years, of vetting. When you look around the world, there are approximately 25 million refugees at this point. This year, we're going to let in 18,000. Now, I'm not saying by any means that we should be letting in 25 million people. Because one of my panelists, my co-panelists may think I'm saying that. But I do think that we as a country have an opportunity to provide protection to folks who have met certain criteria to make sure that we're staying safe. Now, in a place like Texas, who has been gracious enough to resettle refugees here, we've seen hundreds of millions of dollars in economic growth in the state of Texas because of that. So there was a great article actually about Amarillo, Texas, where it's a city of 300,000 people that is thriving to in large degree because of the contributions of refugees. So it is a difficult issue. It's a scary issue when we talk about and we think about refugee resettlement. But we do have the systems in place. We do have a civic society and a faith community that's in place that's ready and willing to take these very constructive steps forward.
There's two pieces here you're talking about. What you're really talking about is asylum more than refugees. I know they're similar. It's hard to sort of keep this stuff straight. But what Italy is seeing with people swarming, onto its islands, what Greece was seeing, because it's actually the reason it happened is because Angela Merkel basically invited them all to go to Germany. That's all asylum. That's comparable to what we're seeing on our southern border here and what Mexico is having to deal with on our other southern border, if you will, down with Guatemala. Refugee resettlement is something we haven't talked about enough, and that's what Ali was talking about. That's obviously relevant because Governor Abbott said for this fiscal year, Texas wouldn't be taking any refugees. I'm going to end this panel on a controversial note. I wrote a piece, more controversial than usual. I wrote a piece in National Review. The title of it was, Refugee Resettlement is Immoral. And I stand by that argument, and let me explain why. There are 25 million refugees in the world, and we are never going to take, even Ali wouldn't take 25 million refugees into the United States.
See, he did it.
Even if it were possible.
That was really tricky. I called it. I bet you $10 on it. You didn't know this, right?
But it doesn't matter how many we take. It can never be more than a drop in the bucket. And the amount of money we're going to spend on this is finite. Whatever amount it is, it's finite. And so whatever we spend on refugee protection should be doing the most good for the most people that we can help. Our research shows that resettling a refugee in the United States is 12 times more expensive than taking care of them in the country where they've gotten their initial asylum. In other words, Syrians in Turkey or Lebanon, for instance. Now, it's better to come here, obviously. But because there are so many people to help, is it morally justifiable to send, to use a metaphor, a yacht for one person that's stocked with single malt scotch and caviar instead of throwing 12 life preservers to the people who are splashing around in the water? We are letting the UN, because the UN picks our refugees, decide who they're going to send here. And there really isn't much difference between the ones who get picked and the ones who aren't picked. A lot of it is because they paid off the local employees working for the UN. But even if not, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees puts a list together, all the people they're going to recommend for resettlement. And then they classify them as emergency cases, urgent cases or routine cases. They're almost all routine cases. In other words, they don't have to get out right then. The people we should be taking is the handful of people who literally cannot stay for another second where they are. And we could take all of them that the UN has designated and still take fewer people than this year's refugee cap. Those are the people we take. Anyone else we take, it's purely virtue signaling on our part. It's selfish. We want to take a family, the kid with the teddy bear, we feel good about ourselves, and we don't see the 11 other people we're not helping.
Well, with that note, and I'm getting the hook, I want to thank you again, gentlemen, for being here, for taking part, for participating and contributing so much to this conversation. Thank you for being here, and have a good day.